Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
As part of my work as a chaplain for the police, many of the chaplains have been trained in something called CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management. And it's so that we can help officers as they go through incredibly traumatic events, whether it's something that they themselves were involved in, whether it's something that they witnessed, came to the aftermath of. All of these have the potential of creating a trauma and a stress reaction in human beings. It doesn't matter how well trained you are. It doesn't matter how you've steeled yourself against it. The reality is human beings are affected by these things. And so some of the things that we look for: change of sleep patterns, change of appetite, irritability, inability to interact with people around you that you normally would be able to interact with. As I started to think about this last week and I started to look at myself, I said, loss of appetite, check. Irritability, check. Change of sleep patterns, check. Difficulty work, check. The entire Jewish community, and frankly, much of the world, is in a state of shock. And we started at a place of speechlessness. And last night, I spoke a little bit about that, and I shared the fact that Debbie and I have been texting with people in Israel, people that we know on the different kibbutzim, and at some point in time, the conversation gets to just ein milim. There are no words. Right? There's an inability to describe what we're feeling, and yet at some point in time, we have to find the words. We have to find the ability to express how we feel. We have to hear the words from other people around us who are feeling the same thing. We have to hear the words from our friends, from our allies, instead of a silence saying, we're here. We need those words. And in an attempt to try and put some words to my feelings, I came to the very beginning of this week's Parsha. And there are two words that stand out and stood out in a way that they never have before in my life. I've been able to go through an academic excursus of what these words mean and see it, but the words in the first day of creation, and let's look at it. We're starting on page 3 and page 4, right? When God began to create the heavens and the earth, v'ha'aretz hayata tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu. Now, here it's translated as the earth was unformed and void. But those words, I think, express a lot more than that. Tohu vavohu express a sense of chaos, a sense of disorder, a sense of absence of God's presence. When I look at the beginning of creation, you see God as being outside of all of this. We try to think in Judaism about God as being part of this world and part of creation, being able to see God here. But this was before that. This was this separation, this absence of God's presence, this absence of being able to connect and interact and have creation and God sort of engage with one another. But one of the best interpretations that I found for this was actually Rashi. It shouldn't be a surprise. Rashi usually comes up with pretty good stuff. And he says, Tohu vavahu. Tohu lashon tem'ah. It is a language of astonishment and surprise. And I tried to understand what that meant. And I've read it before, and I've always sort of said, okay, I'm not really sure what Rashi was getting at. But I get it now. I understand it now. When faced with such chaos and desolation and destruction, and we'll get to that in a moment of the other uses of tohu vavohu, there's a shock. There's a tema, there's a surprise. That we say, wait a second, it doesn't make sense. How do we even start to comprehend what it is that's going on? And tohu vavohu is actually a very rare phrase. It only appears, I think, 2 other times in our biblical text. The most poignant one actually is in Isaiah chapter 34. It appears verse 11. And God is speaking through Isaiah about the total and utter destruction of the world, of humanity, of all of these cities that are going against God. This total and utter chaos and destruction. And that is when the words tohu vavohu are used. But that wasn't the thing as I was going through this that surprised me the most. When I went through our our rabbinic texts, there were 2 different sections of Gemara that I had to come to terms with. The first is in Chagiga. And the Gemara actually there is discussing what are the things that were created on the first day. There were 10 things that were created on the first day. And the Gemara says that heaven and earth was created, and tohu vavohu was created on that first day. And that really went against the way that I've always understood it. I said, wait a second, tohu vavohu is a lack of creation. It's an absence of everything. And this text actually comes and says, no, this is part of creation. This is a reality of creation. We have to come to terms to some degree with that. And the second Talmudic text comes from Arachin, and it goes through, and it's a couple of different times. It's talking about certain historical realities. It's talking about the king Yehoiakim and the king Tzidkiyahu, and each of these kings created a situation where God was tempted to allow the world to revert back to tohu vavohu. And then God stepped back from that cliff and said, no, I'm going to keep things going. So how do we bring these texts together? Right? How do we bring these 3 texts together? We've got our biblical texts, tohu vavohu, this chaos. We've got the rabbinic idea that it was actually part of creation. And we've got this reality that humanity can cause this world to revert back to tohu vavohu. There are no answers today, and you know, I try to to come and to say, here's what Judaism says. Here's the guidance that Judaism gives us. There's no answer to the feelings, to the tohu vavohu that we are feeling in our lives, except perhaps for looking back at our text today. It says, the earth was tohu vavohu, and a darkness was over the water of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. There's a lot of texts that try to say, well, wait a second, what light was this if we don't get the sun and the moon and the stars till later on in creation, right? What light was this? And our rabbis give different answers. It's a spiritual light, it's a primordial light, it's the light of God's presence. There's a lot of different ways that we can understand that. I'm less interested at the moment in understanding exactly what that original light was than the process. First, a wind swept over the face of the water. Then God said, let there be light. Then there was light. And then God said, okay, this is good. And I think there's something powerful in that process. We do not have the capabilities that God has. And by the way, the whole point of creation was a process. God could have created everything all at once in an instant, if that is what God chose to do. But God understands that we as human beings can't do that. We need processes. We need something to help move us from one place to another place. So let's think about it. A wind sweeping over the water. Have you ever been out in nature and this wind comes up just from nowhere and just sweeps through everything? You feel it. You feel it in a different way. There's always wind, there's always air, there's always things moving, right? But every once in a while, a wind comes that's transformative, and it's almost as if we're saying, here is a havdalah, here is a break between one moment and a next. And it allows us to be in that moment and to capture that moment. And perhaps that's what was being said here. That's what God said before, in order to separate between this tohu vavohu and the goodness of creation, the light in creation, those things that are actually good in the world. And it's hard in the midst of challenge and sadness to see that. We need that physical change. It can't just be something that happens up here. We need to get up, we need to move, we need to walk. We need to talk, we need to be with people. We need to change the state that we were in. And I'm sure many of us, for these first few days of all of this happening, were stuck. I was in the same place for hours watching the TV, watching the news, switching between the American channels and the Israeli channels and just trying. And it was the same thing, by the way. At a certain point in time, we all know it was the same stories. Some of these stories I could tell you verbatim what was going to happen because I've heard it so many times, and yet we still sat there. We were paralyzed. We needed, at some point in time, I needed to say to myself, I have to get up. I have to change my place. I have to do something. I have to turn this off and read something else. We as human beings need that. And then before the action, and it doesn't say, for God, the action is in the Word. And God said, let there be light. We need to vocalize it. If we want to change the way that we're feeling, if we want to change, to deal with our status, we have to talk about it. We have to be able to start to get it out. Find the words to express. Find the tears to come out. Find the anger to just be able to go and scream. Whatever it is, we need to find a way to have that moment, and then we can start to say, okay, now we look around and we say, what is it? God saw that the light was there. God saw a difference. And then we can recognize those differences as being good. And we're not there yet. But it's part of the process. For God, it all happened in an instant. For us, for human beings, it takes longer. Days, months, years sometimes to process through a transition from tohu vavohu into light. We need to give ourselves that space, that grace, to be able to do that. It's okay. There's a lot of memes that went out that I found very powerful when it says, when somebody asks you if it's okay, if you're okay, it's okay to say no. Or the memes that went out to say, no, the Jewish community is not okay. Our lives right now are in tohu vavohu. We're still hearing, we're still reeling, there are still people who can't even get to the speaking phase yet, to the talking phase yet. We were speaking with a friend, Debbie was texting with a friend of ours who lived, I don't even know what the proper tense is anymore, on kibbutz Nachal Oz. And she said, I can't talk. Maybe one day. I can't even talk right now. We have to recognize that. We're still in the early stages of this process. But our tradition does give us a path, not an easy path, but a path to work together, understanding that tohu vavohu is a reality in this world, and that we can bring ourselves back to light and say, please, one day again, ki tov. It's good. That is our prayer. Shabbat shalom.